Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. You have registered to attend the webinar for the Arts and Humanities Council upcoming grant opportunity for individual artists and scholars. My name is Takinia. I'm the Senior Grants Program Manager for the Arts and Humanities Council. I'm here discussing the funding opportunity with my colleagues, Anna Alicia, she is our grants coordinator, and Karen Judson, who is also a grants manager for the council. So I am going to show you the agenda for today. We will include a brief introduction describing what the council does and why we exist. We'll discuss the grants process for this funding opportunity. We'll go over the grant guidelines, which are publicly available on the council's website. We'll discuss the required application materials. My colleague Anna Alicia will cover Fluid Review, the online portal that all applicants are required to use if you are applying for this funding opportunity. We will also cover grant writing tips for how to submit a competitive proposal. And we will also answer questions at the end of the presentation. I'm going to ask all of you to be patient while I go through the presentation in its entirety before I address questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat icon. If you click on this icon, you can actually type your question to me. You can type your question at any point during this presentation. Just know that if you type your question while I'm speaking during the presentation, before I've actually stopped speaking and before the presentation concludes, know that I will not get to your question until technically the end of the presentation, which will be obvious by the last slide that blatantly states questions, and that's when I'll answer all of your questions. So again, feel free to type any questions you have at any point in this question field by clicking on the chat icon, and I'll address those questions at the end of the slide presentation. So the Arts and Humanities Council is a local arts agency. We exist to support our creative economy and its beautiful diversity. Our funding is relegated to Montgomery County. We receive funds from the Montgomery County government. These are public funds, meaning that these are taxpayer funds, and we re-grant these funds that we receive from our local government to all of the fabulous artists and scholars and organizations that exist in our county that support the arts and humanities. The mission statement and the vision statement listed on the slide here is available on our website, and it's also available in our guidelines, so I'm not going to read it word for word, but know that we exist to support the fabulous work that you all do. The county is also devoted to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, also known by the acronym DEIA. We have an equity and inclusion statement and also an ADA compliance statement within all of our guidelines. So know that we are very proud of the fact that we work in a county that is very diverse. It's very diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of economics, the full bit, and we do want to make sure that the funding we distribute supports the diversity within our county in its entirety. So when you think about how to construct a project that may implement diversity, when we think about diversity, we think about it broadly. So it's race, ethnicity, it's gender, it's age, it's sexual orientation, thinking about the LGBTQ+ communities. We also want to support differently abled individuals. If you have any questions about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, feel free to contact our staff at any point. And also know that we want to make sure that the activities we fund are accessible. When you look at our guidelines within the ADA compliance statement, there's actually a hyperlink at the end of the statement that you can click on where you can read more about how to make projects accessible. To give you an example, let's say you are a writer, let's say you're a poet, and you apply for funding to do a public reading of your poetry, and let's say you want to make sure that people who are hearing impaired can understand your poetry, and you decide that you want to pay someone who is a sign interpreter, we welcome that. That would be a competitive addition to your project, and also know that that's something we're happy to pay for. So that's a project cost that you can include in your project budget. We're always happy to pay for ADA compliance costs. And again, if you have any questions about how to make your activities accessible, or if a cost is allowable that's related to accessibility, feel free to contact us at any point before the deadline. This is a slide that describes our grant process. So as you all know, the application deadline has been publicized as well as our guidelines. This is the time of the year where you make sure to register for a webinar, which you have smartly done, or come to a workshop. Contact us with any questions you have before the deadline pertaining to anything. If there's a section of the guidelines you don't understand, if you're not sure if your project is eligible, if you're unsure about project competitiveness, if anything of that nature, if you have questions about how to operate fluid review, this is when you contact staff, and you do it before the deadline. And I'm going to emphasize again, before the deadline, because once the deadline is passed, staff can't help you. When the deadline has passed, staff will do a check to make sure that all of the applications we've received are eligible. And when I say eligible, I mean just that, not competitiveness. We're not checking for competitiveness at this stage. We're checking to make sure that all of the activities described within the proposal are in alignment with what's allowable within our guidelines. And we'll discuss what's allowable and what's not allowable further into this presentation a little bit later. If for some reason we find that your project is not eligible, do know that we will contact you and we will let you know why your project is not eligible. If you don't hear from us at this stage, that's a good sign. That means that your project is eligible, and that means that your project will be forwarded to the panel. Now, the panel is a body of professionals, and they discern which projects are competitive, and they will evaluate your project based on the published evaluation criteria that is publicly available in our guidelines. It's on page 7 of the guidelines. Again, we'll discuss the evaluative criteria in more detail later on in this presentation. The panel is always a diverse collective of individuals who have extensive knowledge of both the arts and the humanities sector. We make sure that our panels are diverse in every sense of the word, so they'll, embody ethnic, racial diversity, age diversity, etc. We do make sure that the panel also represents diversity of professional expertise, meaning that there'll be at least one person on the panel who's an expert in marketing. We'll have another person who's an expert in community outreach. We'll have another person who's an expert in financial management, because all of these aspects of your project will be evaluated in addition to the artistic or scholarly components of your project. And again, all panelists will have extensive knowledge of both the arts and humanities sector. The panel review meetings are public. We encourage applicants to attend. It's a wonderful learning opportunity where you get to hear the panel discuss the strengths and areas of your project that may need improvement. They'll discuss all of that. If you are unable to attend, you will be able to request a feedback appointment from staff later. Once we make the award notifications public, you can contact staff for a feedback appointment where we will discuss the panel's critique of your proposal. So after the panel meeting is done, our grants committee will review the panel's assessment. When they are done with their review of the panel's assessment, the grants committee will report to the board. The board, the Arts and Humanities Council board, always has the final say on who receives an award. And again, once the board makes their final determination, we make grant awards public, and that's when you can contact staff for a feedback appointment. Even if you receive an award, it's actually really smart to contact staff for a feedback appointment, because even if you receive an award, if you get feedback, there's the opportunity to make your proposal even stronger the next time you apply for a grant through the council. So I'm going to go through the grant guidelines, which again are also available on our website. We highly encourage you to read the guidelines more than once. There's a lot of information in there, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions about the guidelines, even after I go through them during this presentation. So this funding opportunity exists to support individual artists and scholars. We support the creation and production of new work. We provide funding for artists and scholars who wish to strengthen their business or managerial skills, their artistic skills, their scholarly skills. We want to nurture individual artists and scholars who reside in Montgomery County. We want to support the innovative, distinct, unique, artistic, and scholarly work that you do. And I use the phrase scholarly to refer to the humanities sector in general, just to give you clarity about that label. When we say scholarly, we're referring to the humanities. And we encourage the use of basically the implementation of any methods you may have of achieving equity, equity, diversity, not diversion, equity, diversity, inclusion and access in the field. And applicants may apply for awards that range from $1,000 to $5,000. This means that you cannot apply for less than $1,000 and you cannot apply for more than $5,000. So the Arts and Humanities Council has gone through a lengthy period of time where we have reviewed all of our funding opportunities to basically revamp our whole funding process. And this is just a slide that explains how we went about implementing changes within our funding opportunity. We researched a number of different grant makers all over the country. We distributed surveys to the field to get feedback on how our categories could be revamped. We, included the grants committee and the board. We had public listening sessions for our community where applicants like you were invited to come and give us feedback on our funding opportunities. And so the changes that are part of this funding opportunity are a result of all of the feedback that we've received from the community and from applicants such as yourself, and also from other grant makers who are engaged in the same type of work that we do. So this category does have a few important changes that were not a part of this funding opportunity during the previous fiscal year. We have made it clear, even more clear in the guidelines, that this funding opportunity is meant to support individuals, not groups. And that's because we have other grant categories available for organizations and groups. This really is focused on individual artists and scholars. So let me give you an example. If you are a musician who's part of a jazz band, do not apply for this grant to support the full jazz band. That's not allowable. Here's what you can do. If you are a composer, for example, and you want funding to help support your compositions, your jazz compositions, that is perfectly allowable. And let's say in your proposal that you've identified a band that will perform in your group, that's great, but know that the funding will go directly to you as a jazz composer, not to everyone in the band. It's really supposed to support your individual work as a composer. And again, if you have any questions about you know, making sure that your project is eligible in this regard, feel free to contact us. We have in years past had some confusion with applicants who, you know, basically are trying to get an award for a collective and know that we have another funding opportunity that can help support groups of artists or scholars. And if you're interested in that funding opportunity, contact staff and we can port you to that funding opportunity. We have broadened the scope of eligible projects in that if you are working on a larger project and you need funding for a specific phase, we can fund that specific phase of the larger project. You just need to provide a very clear description about that phase. And again, if you need some help for how to describe the exact phase of that larger project, feel free to contact staff. And we also are now requiring individual artists and scholars to pay themselves. So that means that, for example, if you are a sculptor and you are working on the creation of a new sculpture and you're working by yourself in your studio, we need you to pay yourself a wage for working in that studio. You can also include other allowable project costs, such as the tools you may need to create that sculpture, the cost of the clay used to build that sculpture, but we need you to also pay yourself a wage for the amount of time you're spending during your during the allowable period of support creating your work. Let's say you are working 8 hours a day in the studio, include a wage for yourself for the amount of time you're working in that studio. And again, if you have any questions about that, contact staff. I don't want you to be worried about the perception of looking like you're overpaying yourself. Sometimes artists get self-conscious or scholars get self-conscious and they worry that the panel will think that the artist is asking for too much to pay themselves. Know that the staff at the council and the panelists we recruit want to see artists paid. Very often artists are underpaid, and we are aware of that. And so what will bother the panel more is if the panel thinks that you are undervaluing your work and underpaying yourself. And again, I know this is somewhat complicated subject matter, so you can always contact us if you're confused, but do not hesitate to pay yourself. The only way that this rule isn't a requirement is if you are asking for funding for professional development. Like, let's say if you're applying for a grant to attend a professional conference, you don't really have to pay yourself, and that we cover other costs related to that. So let's say you're applying to go to this conference, you can include the cost of the flight, the cost of the hotel, and given that $5,000 isn't a lot of money, very often all the costs that are involved in professional development can be covered by our grant without paying yourself. Again, if any of this confuses you, don't hesitate to reach out to staff. But if you're asking for funding for a project that does not involve professional development, such as attending a conference, you should definitely include a cost in your budget for paying yourself for the amount of time it takes you to create your work or to engage in the scholarly research that you're doing, etc. Okay, so this is the application deadline. Please memorize this deadline, put it on your calendars, set reminders for yourself. And I say that because we cannot accept late applications. I've been a grant maker for a very long time, and each year that I have a funding deadline, you know, I usually get a couple of phone calls the day after the deadline from someone who is begging to get an extension because they had like a tech issue or they ran into some other problem the day before the deadline. Sadly, we cannot help you out if you miss the deadline. If you miss the deadline, you're just going to have to wait another year until this funding opportunity is offered again. So please make sure that you submit your application by Friday the 7th, February 7th, by 11:59 p.m. I highly encourage you not to wait to submit your application. Don't wait until the day of the deadline. Try your best to submit it early. Annalicia will discuss this in more detail, but know that, if you submit your application early in Fluid Review, let's say you are working on your application and you submit it on February 1st, and then you notice, oh my gosh, I totally forgot to include more details about my marketing plan for the visual art that I'm displaying to the public. You can still get back into your application and add additional information. So even after you hit the submit button, you can still get back into your application as long as it's before the deadline. So the smart way to do this is to submit your proposal early so that you have some time to make corrections if need be. And you can get back into your application as long as you do that before February 7th, before 11:59 p.m., specifically on February 7th. So in order to be eligible for this funding opportunity, the applicant must be a resident of Montgomery County. You have to have resided in the county for at least 12 consecutive months before the submission deadline. Applicants must be at least 21 years old. You can't be a full-time student. You have to be currently a practicing artist or scholar with demonstrated ability in the arts or humanities, and you must be able to provide the council with a social security number so that we can pay you if you receive an award. Here's additional information about project eligibility. You are only allowed to submit one artist and scholar project grant application per fiscal year. Projects can cover the development of new work, improving your skills, your managerial skills, your artistic skills, your skills in the humanities discipline. The project, again, must benefit the individual applicant that is applying. If you are applying for a project that's open to the public, that project must occur in Montgomery County. So to give you an example, if you're a visual artist and you would like to display your paintings in a gallery, if that gallery is in Chicago, that's not an eligible project, but if the gallery is in Montgomery County, that's an eligible project. You can, again, request funding for the one phase of a larger project as long as the phase is described clearly within the application narrative. And know that all of your activities must take place between July 1st and June 30th. That means that we can't pay for any pre-award costs. So if you have, let's say, marketing costs, for example, that occur in June, we can't pay for that. We can only pay for costs that you incur no earlier than July 1st, and we also can't pay for post-award costs. So let's say you have costs for the deinstallation of your exhibition in August, we also can't pay for that. We can only pay for costs that you incur between July 1st and June 30th. So these are more examples of eligible projects. This is not an exhaustive list, so if you are thinking of a project that's not represented within this list, just give us a call and we can let you know whether or not the project is eligible. Note that this is a multidisciplinary funding opportunity and we don't rank disciplines at all, so that means that every discipline is eligible. That's performing arts, visual arts, literary arts, design, the humanities and its diversity. All of those disciplines are eligible. You can create, you can write a book, you can record music, we can pay for professional development, travel to a conference, we can pay for, maybe you're doing intensive study with someone who's considered a master in the field, like let's say you are a let's say you're a dancer and choreographer and you have a specific interest in traditional Indonesian dance, and you've found a master choreographer who is a folk and traditional arts specialist, specifically in Indonesian dance, and you want to study with this person, we can pay for that. There's a lot that we can pay for in terms of various different eligible project types. So again, if you're confused about whether or not your project is eligible, just contact us. So here are the limitations for what we cannot fund. We can't fund capital improvements, construction or renovation. We can't fund fundraising activities. We can't fund the cost of receptions, refreshments, or food. So again, let's say as a hypothetical, you are a poet. I brought this example up earlier. You're doing a public reading of your work, and let's say after your reading you decide to have wine and cheese. We can't pay for the wine and cheese. We can pay for other elements of the project, but we can't pay for the reception, refreshments, or food. We can't pay for the purchase of property. So let's say you are, again, a sculptor, and you need to you decide that you want to own a studio, and you decide to buy studio space. We can't pay for the purchase of that space itself. We can pay for, if you have rental costs, we can pay for that. So let's say you're renting a studio, we can pay for that. But if you want to own a studio, we can't pay for the purchase of that property. We can't pay for activities that are for the exclusive benefit of an organization's members. We can't pay for your debt. When we say we can't pay for scholarships or awards, very often scholarships and awards are effectively a form of re-granting, so we can't pay for that. So let's say you are again, a sculptor, and you decide that you want to influence a younger generation of sculptors, and you've identified a group of teenagers who are interested in making sculptures, and you want to develop some sort of scholarship fund to support their work. You apply for a grant for us, and you want to use our money to then pass on to these teenagers as a form of scholarship. While that might be well-intentioned, we can't pay for that because that's a form of re-granting. We can't pay for political advocacy or activities that support a specific political candidate or a political party of any sort. And importantly, we get this question a lot, we cannot fund any activities outside of the United States. So I brought up the example earlier of an individual who seeks funds to attend a professional conference. If this conference is in Paris, unfortunately, we cannot pay for it. We can pay for a conference that's outside of the county in another state. So if your conference is in Pennsylvania, we can pay for that, but we can't pay for that conference in Europe. If, you know, the example I gave earlier of the choreographer who's interested in traditional Indonesian dance, unfortunately, we cannot pay for you to go to Indonesia to study traditional Indonesian dance. The master that you study with has to actually work in the United States, and we also cannot pay for visa costs associated with travel outside of the United States. So here's the review criteria. I briefly mentioned this earlier. This is what the panel uses to assess the quality and competitiveness of your proposal. It is also on page 7 of our guidelines. Please pay very close attention to the review criteria when you're writing your application, answering the narrative questions, when you're thinking about your work samples, your supplementary materials. Always refer back to the evaluative criteria. This should be a constant thread throughout your proposal. Again, I'm going to point you to the guidelines because we have 4 evaluative criteria, but it's broken down in more detail within our guidelines. So for example, quality of work, we've defined that as the artistic quality of the work sample submitted with the application, the applicant demonstrating ongoing commitment to the artistic or scholarly discipline, and the innovation and creativity, and the performing, presenting, and or producing of the art form or the scholarly discipline or the humanities discipline. For proposal and project merit, we've defined that as the impact of the proposed project on the artist or scholar's work and career, the appropriateness of the applicant's objective for the proposal, and the likelihood that the applicant's project will meet the stated objectives that are described in the narrative. For community impact, we've defined that as the potential impact of the proposed project on the intended audience, clear community or intended audience outreach strategy, accessibility, meaning the potential to reach underserved populations such as those whose opportunities to experience the arts and humanities are limited by geography, ethnicity, economics, or disability. And for applicants requesting funding for professional development, clear indication that the professional development opportunity will enhance the applicant's future communal impact after the professional development has concluded. So everything that I've just read is listed in the guidelines. And I want to talk briefly about community impact because this can be a bit complicated for individual artists and scholars. When it comes to community impact, a number of you may have to think about your future community because obviously you can apply for funds for work that hasn't been created yet. So I'm going to give you an example. We actually funded a project in FY20 for a creative writer. This creative writer is writing within the category of Afrofuturism, also known as speculative fiction, with a focus on people of African descent. And the thing that made one of the aspects of her project that was particularly impressive for the panel is that she described the importance of her work and that the sci-fi field historically has not reflected diversity. Back in the day, traditionally, that field was dominated primarily by Caucasian men. And so the fascinating thing about speculative fiction and Afrofuturism is that this genre has diversified the sci-fi category by the inclusion of women of color specifically who have decided to focus on people of color as the subject matter of their storytelling. And by doing so, this author is diversifying a literary category, but also diversifying the potential reading audience that will probably be attracted to her work, which was also discussed. So while historically sci-fi, again, was dominated by Caucasian men, and there have been a number of articles written by that category having a following by a reading population that is not diverse. This applicant who became a grantee has the potential to both diversify her reading audience and also diversify the specific artistic discipline. So that's a clear example of someone who received funding for work that was not created at the time of the application because she was requesting money to actually write her work of Afrofuturism, but she had a clear idea of how her work could incorporate diversity, access, and inclusion, and how her potential target demographic would also represent a most likely a diverse collective of people of color. So I hope that example is clear. There are various different ways to incorporate community impact. I'll throw out another hypothetical. Let's say theater is your discipline and you are a script writer and you've decided to write a play that would be particularly accessible to patrons who are on the autism spectrum. There's been some pretty amazing work that theater companies have done with diversifying audience in terms of disability. That's another hypothetical as well. There are various different ways to infuse diversity and access into your project. And again, if you have any questions about creative ways that this can be done, or if it's clear If you have questions about whether or not this aspect of your proposal is clear, feel free to contact us. We're happy to discuss it. And then I'll quickly touch on admin capability, which is actually the smallest point allotment in the evaluative criteria. But basically, it's evidence of strong admin skills, and that includes the clarity of your project timeline, your budget, potential efforts to generate other sources of income to offset the funding that you could receive from the Arts and Humanities Council. And again, I can't overemphasize how important it is to always come back to the evaluative criteria when you're working on your application. So a few additional important notes to keep in mind. Again, a friendly reminder that this funding opportunity is for individuals, not groups. You are allowed to receive this award for 2 consecutive years in a row, and then after that, you'll basically have to sit out for a year. So to be clear, if you received an award in FY19 and FY20, that means that you're not eligible for FY21. You'll have to sit out for a year, but then you could reapply in FY22. If you received an award in FY19 but then was declined in FY20, you are allowed to apply again in FY21 because that's not 2 consecutive years. And again, it's 2 consecutive years before the deadline. So that means that, to give you a hypothetical, if you applied in FY15 and then you got an award for FY16 and FY17, you can still reapply because years have passed. More than a year has passed since you last received an award. If you got 2 awards, if you got, awards in 2 consecutive years a long time ago, you're definitely welcome to reapply. If you have any questions about this rule, don't hesitate to contact us. If you are an artist or scholar and you work for an arts or humanities organization that is a grantee of the council, so let's say you are a creative writer and you work for the Writer Center, that's not a problem. You can still apply as an individual creative writer. Just make sure that the work that you do is in no way related to the activities that the Writer Center receives funding for under the Arts and Humanities Council. These have to be distinctly different projects that we're funding. And, I'll say it again, we can't fund the same project in more than one grant category. Okay. So if you were to receive an award, we will give you the full grant amount after we have received important paperwork from you, the final report from a previous grant if applicable. So if you received a grant in FY20 and then you get a grant in FY21, make sure you have submitted your final report so that we can pay you. You'll need to provide a signed grant agreement, a W-9. You'll have to fill out an ACH direct deposit form, a voided check, and we cannot pay you until we receive payment from the county. So I'm going to quickly go over the required application materials. All applicants should submit a completed narrative with a project budget. Please don't skip questions. Sometimes we get applications where an applicant has decided that a question isn't really applicable to them, so they leave a question blank. That is not a smart move. The panel will notice, so please fill out the full application. And please make sure that you submit a project budget. And importantly, you'll see a section of the application where you're allowed to provide a more detailed description of your budget, what we call the project budget notes. Please fill that out. Some applicants decide not to fill that out, and that's not to your advantage. Because these are public funds, the more detail you provide about your costs and income, the better. So please make use of the project budget notes that are within the application. Please include bios, if applicable, if there are other people who will help bring your project into fruition. So I want to be clear, again, this grant is for individuals, so the funding will go to you, but let's say you are working, let's say you're a visual artist and you're going to have your paintings displayed in a gallery, and you are going to work with someone who is a marketing expert, and you're really proud of how this individual has done an excellent job marketing other visual artists, you can include a bio of that person. That's a random hypothetical. Include your programming support materials and your work samples as well. So your programming support materials should show off how fabulous your work is. So this can include positive reviews of previous work that you've created in the form of newspaper clippings. You can include a program booklet. So let's say you are a scholar who is focused on writing about let's say visual art. Let's say you're an art historian and you've done some excellent research on art created in again, a random hypothetical, Indonesia. And let's say you've presented your work at a prestigious conference. You can include a flyer representing that conference. You can include brochures that would show off where your work has been displayed or where you've spoken. You can include flyers that represent marketing that's been used to promote previous work that's been created. When it comes to programming support materials and work samples, I want to remind you to think like a curator. It is not your benefit to upload a PDF that includes 50 documents. The panel won't be able to absorb 50 documents. Include a few documents that really show off how excellent your work is. So if you see that there's a really strong review of your work, include that. Or if you have a couple of photos that are really strong, don't include photos that are subpar just because you happen to have them. You really want to choose the best of the best to really demonstrate how excellent your work is. When it comes to work samples, again, think like a curator. You know, don't submit 10 videos. Don't upload 15 audio samples. You want to choose samples that really strongly highlight why your work is excellent. Make sure that the samples are really obvious. So to give you an example, we had one year where an applicant submitted as a work sample a newspaper review of their work, and then there was a link within that article that was a hyperlink that sent panelists to an audio recording of their work. Don't do that. It confused panelists because it was a buried work sample. While you are definitely encouraged to submit hyperlinks as a work sample, meaning that let's say you are a vocalist and you have a stellar recording of yourself singing on YouTube, you can submit a PDF with a live hyperlink, but make sure that that's really all it is, that it's very obvious what this hyperlink is. You can submit a PDF that says, click on this hyperlink to hear an audio recording of me singing Summertime from Porgy and Bess. That's easy, the panel will get that. They'll click on the link and that'll send them directly to that recording. Know that you do have time limits with audio and video. So if you don't have the capacity to edit this audio of you singing Summertime, what you can do is give the panel direction. So let's say you want the panel to listen to the first 3 minutes of you singing Summertime from Porgy and Bess. You can simply write those directions in the PDF. You can tell them to fast forward a few minutes or stop listening, you know, after 3 minutes. Feel free to give them instructions that's helpful for them. If you are a visual artist, you can upload a maximum of 15 images. If you're working in the humanities or if you're a writer of any sort, you can upload documents that show off your impeccable writing skills, but you are limited to 10 pages because, again, there's but so much a panel can absorb in one sitting, and know that they have to go through a lot of applications, which is why it's really important for you to choose your work samples carefully. So there are a variety of acceptable file formats for fluid review. My colleague Annalicia will go through all of this in more detail. Again, for documents, submit PDFs only. And if you have any questions about appropriate file formats, you can contact us. But you know, we make this clear within the guidelines and within fluid review when you actually enter the site. And I'm going to pass the baton over to my colleague Annalicia, who will go over fluid review.
Hello, this is Annalicia Fang speaking. I'm going to run through the fluid review application section. I hope this section won't be too long. I hope that fluid review is intuitive, but if for some reason it is not, then please feel free to reach out with any questions. So we recommend using Google Chrome or Firefox for best performance, but fluid review should work on most acceptable browsers. This is what our grants program homepage looks like. This is where you sign in. And if you don't have an account, then you just click the gray sign up button at the bottom right-hand corner. It'll ask you to fill out just a standard, sign up page with your name, your email, a new password. Fluid review does require a phone number, so just keep that in mind. Then just click create account. You should get an email, which is a confirmation link. If you don't get an email, then please call or email the Arts and Humanities Council, and we can try and work that out with you. So after you sign in, this will be your account homepage. You will see this page every time that you log in. If you have applied with the council through fluid review before, then this is where you will see any past applications. However, if you're a new applicant, then you will see this page exactly as it is. And to view any open grants that we have, just click the blue View Grants button at the bottom left-hand corner. And here you will see all of the grants available at this time with the Arts and Humanities Council. So just scroll down and read the name of each category and make sure you click on the right one. So obviously, you would be looking for FY21 Artists and Scholars Project Grants. I believe that's at the very bottom of the page at this time. And to start your application, just click the gray Create Submissions button all the way to the right. So after you click that button, it will take you to this page. This is your application homepage. So you'll see your name at the very top with a unique submission number, and you will see the name of the grant category immediately under. Please make sure that you are applying for the correct grant. It has happened in the past where people accidentally click a similar sounding grant. They don't realize that they're applying for something else. So when you start the application form, the narrative, this is just kind of a general snapshot of what that looks like. So we'll be asking for basic information. Please know that all required questions are marked with an asterisk. And regardless, if you try to move on to a next page, fluid review will actually tell you if you haven't completed any of the required questions. There are page labels at the top, such as overview, evaluative criteria, project budget, and work sample, and you can navigate the form through those pages. If you, for some reason, want to see the application in its entirety, instead of clicking page by page and having to go through this whole required questions limitation, then you can actually download a Word version at the top of the page. Just please know that all official submissions have to be through fluid review. We do not accept any emailed applications or applications delivered by hand. This is an example of what the actual narrative questions look like. So you'll see the evaluative criteria at the top. So for example, quality of work or proposal and project merit, and then the relevant questions below. Please be sure to save your work as you go. This form doesn't auto-save, and just make sure that you are writing your answers within the character limits. Most questions have a character limit of about 2,000, but again, fluid review will tell you when you're within or exceeding the character limit. This is what the project budget looks like. I will say that all the information that you need to know is in the instructions at the top, so please read through those. those instructions will tell you that you must asterisk all expenses that will be paid for by the council. This is something that is very important to the panel because it helps them clearly see how funds will be used. You must also include the AHCMC grant in your project income, and you must make sure that both expenses and income are equal. Again, this is a project budget. So something particular to fluid review, do not use the $ or any commas within the amount column. So if your expense is $1,000, just put in 1000. Don't add a comma, don't add a $. And like Takina mentioned earlier, remember to pay yourself if you're creating and or presenting any work. Takina also touched on this earlier. Please don't ignore the budget notes. This is also something that panelists pay attention to. These are required questions, so you are required to submit a response, but like she said earlier, don't submit something brief. Be sure to go into detail. So whenever you finish a task, you will see this green completion bar at the top. And even after completing a task, you are allowed to go back in and edit it. It just means that so far this task is done. All the required questions have been answered. To upload a file, this is what the page will look like. So you will see instructions at the top. You will see all supported file types to the right. And then in that gray box, just click the blue Browse for Files button to select a file. Any selected files will appear at the bottom under Uploaded Files. And when you're done with your upload, just click back to Submission to take you back to the application homepage. So once you have done everything that is required for this application and you want to submit, make sure that the Submit Your Application button, which will be at the bottom, make sure that this button is a vibrant blue. If it's kind of gray, that means that it's not accessible, and that means that you have not completed all required tasks. When you are eligible to submit, the button will be blue and you will be able to click on it. If you do not hit this button, then your submission has not been submitted. And unfortunately, staff cannot help you. And even if your application was complete, we can't consider it as an application that will go to panel. So when you click that submit button, it will just ask you, are you sure that you want to submit? And it will remind you that you can actually continue to edit your application up until the day of the deadline, even after submitting. So please do not be scared of the submit button. Again, you will see this green bar that says your submission has been submitted. You should receive an email. If for some reason you don't receive an email, please reach out immediately. Don't wait a week and say, hey, did you guys get my submission? Please reach out to us as soon as you can so that we can sort this out. If you want to download your submission, which we highly recommend you do, it will be on the right-hand side, kind of where you have like your profile and where you can add a member, things like that. There will be a button that shows up that says download, download your submission. And I'm going to pass it back to Takina.
Thank you, Ana Alicia. That was very helpful. So I'm going to quickly go over some general grant writing and proposal tips to keep in mind so that your proposal is as competitive as can be. Do not wait until the last minute to start your application or to hit the submit button. I can't overemphasize this. Please do not start your application on the day of the deadline and then try to hit the submit button at 11:58 on February 7th. Keep in mind that even though I say this all the time, don't wait until the last minute. There are plenty of applicants who will still wait until the last minute. And what happens is that fluid review will move slower if everyone is trying to submit their application at the same time. So sometimes what will happen is that an applicant will try to hit the submit button at 11:58. They'll see that circle moving on the screen. That means that their application is in the process of trying to get submitted through fluid review. And then when 11:59 hits, that's it. So there's always the chance that if you wait till the last minute, you'll deal with slowness on the portal and your application may not come through. Don't put yourself in that position. Better to hit the submit button early, and then if you think of something you want to add, you can jump back in and add whatever you need to your application before the deadline passes, but please don't wait until the last minute. That's very risky. It's always good to have someone who's not familiar with your work to proofread your application to make sure that it's clear and understandable. I think it's really easy when you're doing the same work every day to make assumptions about what's clear in your application. So, you know, if you're a writer who's been working on a particular novel for 2 years and, you know, you think your project is clear. It may not be. It may be that, you know, you're making assumptions about what is clear. So give it to someone who maybe has no understanding of the genre that you write in. Maybe give it to someone who is not a professional writer at all. Maybe give it to someone who's like a visual artist as a random hypothetical, just to make sure that it's clear to an outsider. You can't assume that the panel will know all the details of your work as an individual. Always refer to the grant guidelines while you're working on your proposal. I always suggest reading the guidelines more than once. There's a lot in there. There's a lot to absorb, particularly if you're a new applicant. And if you're ever confused about anything that's written in the guidelines, please don't hesitate to contact us. Read the instructions on fluid review carefully. Again, this is also why it's good to make sure that you start your application earlier, because if you run into any tech issues, we can't help you past 5 o'clock on the day of the deadline. We have traditional office hours. So if you're working on your application on the day of the deadline at 11:30 at night and you run into a tech issue, we can't help you. You're on your own. Think about your support materials and your work sample far in advance. This can be one of the most challenging aspects of the proposal in terms of uploading these items, but also to picking which items are the best for your proposal. Again, I always say, think like a curator. Please don't send us 30 images and, you know, 30 images are a mixture of work that's mediocre, some that's stellar, some that's not. It's more competitive to send 5 images of really stellar work instead of 30 mediocre images. Always remember to call with questions prior to the deadline. Once the deadline is passed, we can't help you out. And if possible, I'm sure all of you are busy, but if it's possible for you all to attend the panel, that's always a smart thing to do for your learning curve. So again, I can't overemphasize how important this deadline is. Please remember that the deadline is Friday, February 7th at 11:59 p.m. Staff will not be in the office at 11 o'clock at night. Once we hit 5 o'clock, you're on your own. Applications must be submitted through the online portal. We can't accept applications that are not submitted on Fluid Review, so don't mail the application, don't hand deliver it, don't email it, just submit your application and your supporting materials and your work sample through Fluid Review. And we cannot accept late applications. So if you are, you know, claiming that your application was done at 11:59 and it just didn't come through the portal, if we don't receive it, if we don't see if there's no evidence that the submit button was hit, we can't help you out. So don't fear the submit button, and we won't be able to submit proposals, you know, the day after February 7th. This is an example. We can only submit proposals that are submitted by the deadline. We encourage you to register for our newsletter so that you're kept in the loop about all of our funding opportunities, our webinars and workshops, any events that we have. These links are also available on our website, so please go ahead and register if you have not done so yet for our webinars, for our newsletters. And also, we have a variety of other helpful resources on our website that are worth exploring. So, you know, please spend some time playing around on our website for your learning curve. And this is the grants team here with our contact info. Our contact info is also on the website. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about the submittal of your proposal or your work samples and support materials. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you may have. I am not seeing any questions at the moment. It looks like none of you have typed questions. I'll give you a minute more just in case you, oh, okay, so a question just popped up. Thank you. How many applications were submitted last year? That is actually a question. I don't have the number memorized. I would say at least 40 proposals. You know that there's always a small number of applications that were not put forward to the panel because we always get a small number that are not eligible, that won't go to panel, but I'd say at least 40 were submitted. There's always the chance that the number of applicants could grow because we have been very intentional about our guidelines revamp, our grant category revamp. We've been talking about this for a long time. We talked about it a lot last year, so I do anticipate that the number of applicants could be higher just because there has been a bit more publicity of our funding opportunities in 2019 compared to 2018. So I hope that answers your question. Really, at the end of the day, all of our funding opportunities are competitive, so I would suggest approaching this assuming that a high number will apply and that a lot of the proposals will be competitive. To say if you want to make sure that you're presenting your A game when you apply for funding from the council. So I have a question about the date of the panel review. The date of the panel review has not been confirmed yet. We have an approximate idea of when the panel will be in terms of the time of the year. It's usually in early spring. It will either be in March or April, but I don't have an exact date yet. As soon as I know, the date will be publicized, and anyone who applies and submits an eligible application will be notified when the panel date is meeting so that you can plan accordingly, but I don't have that date confirmed yet. And I'm going to hold tight just in case there are any additional questions. I'll stay on the line for a couple more minutes. Okay, so I have another question here. This applicant is interested in collaborating with an individual based in Canada. Would traveling there be eligible for your project? We can't pay for that. We can't pay for your travel to Canada. Now, if you are able to entice this person to come to the United States to work with you, that's fine. You can work with this person in the United States, but also keep in mind that the cost to bring this person to the United States, we also can't pay for either. We can only pay for activities occurring in the United States. And importantly, if this is a public project, so let's say this is something that's being presented to the public during the period of support, it would actually have to occur in Montgomery County. So like to give you a hypothetical, I keep coming back to the example of the poet who's doing a poetry reading. If you're seeking funds to present your poetry publicly, that poetry reading would have to occur in Montgomery County. Now, let's say you're a poet who wants to get professional development and you want to go to an important writers conference. That conference does not have to occur in the county. Professional development doesn't have to occur in the county, but it would have to occur in the United States. It couldn't occur in Canada, for example. Okay, so I have another question here. If the project is research for a book and is also an interactive app website, is that eligible? Yeah, that does sound eligible to me, for sure. We can definitely pay for research costs. We can pay for the development of a book, and we could also pay for an interactive app or website. I will say this, if you're seeking funding for the development of an app or website, I do want you to think about accessibility. There are actually various different ways that websites, for example, can be made accessible to those with disabilities. And if you have any questions about that, definitely click on that hyperlink that I mentioned within the guidelines that's embedded in the ADA compliance statement, and you can also contact staff. But it is something to think about if you're asking for funding for a website, the development of a website. I'm going to continue to hang on the line just in case there are additional questions. So far, these questions have been really good, so I thank the applicants who decided to be brave and type in a question. It's always best to ask. Don't make assumptions, folks. And there are no stupid questions. I'm a firm believer in that. I don't want anyone to be self-conscious, particularly when it comes to asking for funds. It's always safest to ask. Don't make assumptions, and don't get self-conscious about the content of your question. It's pretty quiet. I'm not seeing additional. Oh, here's another one. Do you have a range that you would suggest for paying yourself for studio work? So that is a really complicated question, and I would say that you should contact staff because this is a multidisciplinary funding opportunity. The fact of the matter is that the eligible activities will span the gamut in terms of the diversity of the types of activities that we can support. Some of your payment is dependent upon how much time you're spending on your project. So you have a full year of support. So projects can begin as early as July 1st, and they can start anywhere from July 1st through June 30th. They technically are supposed to end on June 30th, but that means that let's say you are an artist and you are asking for funding to create a work of art that you can finish in a week. Obviously, the amount you pay yourself would be lower than an artist who is working on a project that will take 8 months to complete. Some of this may depend on, you know, again, there are certain types of art that are more expensive to create than others as well, and you want to keep that in mind when you're working. So like when it comes to other project costs beyond paying yourself, like let's say tools and supplies, you know, the cost of a camera is more expensive for a photographer than the cost of a paintbrush. Both can be equally competitive in terms of project support, but you want to keep that all in mind when you're developing your budget. So, you know, again, when it comes to questions about the range of funds you should allocate for yourself, we're going to have to take this on a case-by-case basis, so it's probably best to contact staff with the details of your project so we can help guide you on what makes sense to include in terms of your monetary payment for yourself. But I want to emphasize again, I don't want you to worry about looking like you're overpaying yourself. I think what we found more often is artists who look like they're underpaying themselves. So I want you to think realistically about how much it costs to do your work, and know that when it comes to designing your budget, while we can't pay you more than $5,000, your budget can actually be more than $5,000. What you do is you asterisk costs that are costs that you want the council to pay for. But we understand that sometimes artists and scholars have projects that are very expensive and we're only paying for a small portion of that budget, and that's fine as well. So keep that in mind, that your budget itself can be more than $5,000, even though the grant it can't be more than $5,000. And if you're confused about that, just email us or give us a call. So I see more questions popping up here from a playwright. Your play is targeted to family caregivers. I'm just going to keep reading here. You want the production to be in Montgomery County, plus making a film of the play. You would need a team. So this sounds like a really large project. And here's what I would say. Some of the most competitive projects are clearly focused projects. So I would say this. Think about what you can do with up to $5,000. Sadly, $5,000 is not that much money. So $5,000 is not going to cover all of this. So I would choose a segment of what you've listed here. So maybe you need money to write the script for your play. Maybe you need money to maybe you just want to ask for a grant for the filming of your play and you need to buy the equipment for the filming. And I mean, I would choose a portion of this project. And you ask, does every member of your team need to reside in Montgomery County? And the answer is no, because remember, this grant is not for a team. It is for the individual artist. So that means the grant goes to you directly. And I'll say this too, if you are an applicant who really represents a group or a collective, you might want to contact staff and, discern whether or not this really is the most appropriate funding opportunity for you. We have programming and capacity grants that actually can be used to fund groups. So it may be worth calling us or emailing us to figure out which category is more appropriate for your project. But if you're applying as an individual artist or scholar, I would suggest picking one aspect of this project. There's a lot going on here, and I think it might be a little too much for one proposal. So if you need help scaling down and picking one aspect of this project, feel free to contact staff. And then when you say what kind of work samples do you want, that really is dependent upon what you're asking the council to fund. So if you're only asking, for example, us to fund the cost for what it will take to actually write the script, then you want to send work samples that reflect previous scripts that you've written so that the panel can see that you are an accomplished script writer. So your work sample would be samples in previous scripts. So I have another question here. If you have received a grant previously, how distinct does your second year grant proposal have to be from the existing grant? Is there anything to keep in mind as a returning grantee who is applying? So it is perfectly allowable to apply for a project and receive funding in FY20, and let's say that project was super successful. So let's say the project involves you displaying paintings of the rural landscape in certain sections of Montgomery County. And let's say the panel thought this was an awesome idea because very often we don't think about rural communities when it comes to Montgomery County. There's this misperception that Montgomery County is all Bethesda and Silver Spring, these urban pockets, but there are gorgeous communities and the rural sections with gorgeous, patches of land. And let's say you want to focus on that and you want to focus on targeting individuals who live in these rural communities who you feel like have been overlooked. So the panel really liked that work, and you had a lovely exhibition where a lot of people showed up and that you got great feedback from attendees. And let's say you want to continue this series. Let's say you want to do part 2 with another set of paintings that you want to create that are exploring other sections of rural Montgomery County. So what I'm getting at is that if you want to do a project that's very similar to the previous project that you received funding for, there's nothing wrong with that. We've had grantees who have gotten funding for a project one year, and then the next year they want to do a project that's basically the same the next year because it was well received, and there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't make your project less competitive, and it actually can be a very competitive way to go, because if you're able to explain why your previous project was so successful in your application, that can make for a strong argument as well. So I wouldn't say there's anything to keep in mind as a returning grantee who is applying. I'll say this, if you didn't call to receive a feedback appointment, that's worth doing. If you don't know, if you didn't attend the panel meeting last year, but you received a grant, and you have no idea what the panel said, you feel free to contact staff and we can discuss the panel comments with you. I suggest doing that this week. Please don't ask for a feedback appointment like the day before the deadline. Just a heads up that the day before the deadline, we usually receive a dramatic increase in the number of questions. So the earlier you contact us for a feedback appointment, the better. But that's something to keep in mind if you're a returning applicant and you somehow missed the panel and forgot to ask for a feedback appointment. I'm just going to look here to see if there are any additional questions. I'm not seeing any additional questions, but I'm going to stay put just in case a new one pops up. Just scrolling here to make sure I didn't miss a question. Let's see here. I don't think I've missed a question. So it's 4:16. Technically, this webinar was supposed to go till 4, so I thank you for hanging in there and staying longer than anticipated. Please keep in mind that if I accidentally missed your question, my apology, but know that there is still time to ask staff questions. So if I missed your question, or if you have an epiphany and think about a great question tomorrow or next week, feel free to contact Karen or Anna Alicia or myself, and we will be able to help you out. And with that, I'm going to close this webinar. I wish you all the best of luck with your proposals. You know, I know it's not easy work. That's why staff is here to help you. But, you know, we look forward to reviewing your proposals. We look forward to hearing the panel discussing your proposals. And with that, I thank you for attending this webinar and have a lovely afternoon. Take care, all.